Hi, everyone. I'm Adrian Randolph, Dean of Northwestern's Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm thrilled to be here today with many of our European alumni and donors, including those tuning in from Belgium, Germany, France, Switzerland, and the UK. I'd also like to acknowledge our trustees and members of the International Campaign Committee who are joining us today. So, as many of you know, I've been doing a series of virtual conversations with our faculty, and today's should be an exciting one. I'm really looking forward to my conversation with Professor Marina Henke. My hope is that today's conversation brings you sharp insights and interesting perspectives from a Northwestern faculty member on a really topical set of issues. But before we get started with Professor Henke, a few practical matters. First, if you have any technical difficulties during this talk, please use the Q&A function. We have folks on hand behind the scenes who can try to help you. Second, we'll be taking questions for the last 10 to 15 minutes, so please submit them via the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And finally, these and other past virtual conversations with faculty are recorded and available on YouTube. We'll be circulating the links to each of these after this so that you can share with others. So let me now turn my attention to the topic at hand. Today, we will hear from Marina Henke. Professor Henke is an associate professor in our Department of Political Science. Her academic expertise is in international security with a special focus on military interventions, peacekeeping, and European security and defense policy. She's the author of the fascinating Constructing Allied Cooperation, Diplomacy, Payments, and Power in Multilateral Coalitions, which was based on Professor Henke's tireless research, including hundreds of interviews in many languages. The book won the 2020 Lepgold Book Prize for the Best Book in International Relations and the American Political Science Association's 2020 International Collaboration Section Best Book Award. At stake in her work are key issues about how nations and nation states in modernity can forge coalitions and produce collective action, and what the problems are with that sort of enterprise. She's currently on sabbatical, serving as Professor of International Relations at the Hertie School in Berlin and the director of the Hertie Center for International Security. Prior to joining Northwestern, Henke was a Jennings Randolph Peace Scholar with the United States Institutes of Peace. She also served as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Public and International Affairs and worked with the US House of Representatives Ways and Means Committee, European Commission, European Parliament, and German Foreign Office. So Marina, thank you so much for joining us today from Berlin.
Thank you, Adrian. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and chat with you and, of course, the alumni community in Europe and the United States.
So we wanted to discuss with you, as the title of this virtual conversation goes, NATO, the impact of Brexit, and great power politics. Lots of huge topics we're just going to be able to scratch, but hopefully we can get into a few of them in depth. So let's start at the beginning. What are your thoughts on the future of NATO, perhaps especially in light of the recent US election?
So Joe Biden is, of course, good news for NATO. I think this is the bottom line. But I think it's an illusion to think that all the problems that NATO faces will just vanish with the election of Joe Biden. You just mentioned I am currently based in Berlin, and Germans are elated that Biden won the election, but at the same time, they looked as well at the data coming out from the elections, and they saw still 70 million Americans voted for Trump. And so they're scared. They're asking me in another 4 years, will there be another Trump, a Trump Jr., Ivanka Trump, somebody else who has similar ideas of NATO that Trump espoused in his administration? And since for Germany, this is really a question of survival, it has a very weak security force. If you look at it closely, of course, there's skepticism and there are doubts. Can we rely on the United States for the next decades to come? Or we need to construct some kind of alternative security protection force? So this is the first issue that NATO currently struggles with. The second issue, of course, is Turkey. Turkey is right now at loggerheads with two important NATO members. That's France and that's Greece. The Turkish President Erdogan declared a boycott on French products just a couple weeks back. And of course, these kind of actions further hollow out the cohesion of NATO and don't necessarily bode well for the future of NATO.
That brings up so many different questions about what functions are NATO serving today for Europe in terms of security. So what would the impact be of a weaker NATO if it doesn't survive in its present form? And indeed, will it survive? And how you think the EU will proceed in relationship to NATO? Because obviously the EU is emerging in new ways as a foreign policy player. So I'm curious, as opposed to what I assume are the somewhat bilateral relationships with the US and NATO by many states, and how the EU as an entity then is going to evolve with NATO, or will it?
So there's an active debate, as you might imagine, in Brussels on, can the Europeans step up and create some kind of independent security and defense force. And there's a lot of talk about this. There's talk about an EU army, and there's even talk about an EU nuclear deterrent. They call it a Euro deterrent, and it would be based on the French nuclear forces, a modernized version of it, of course. But truth to be told, for now, there's a lot of talk, but very little action. And so why is there little action? Well, if you ask me, it has a lot to do with the fact that European Union member states have a very diverse set of security perceptions. So France, when you look at the EU level, meaning Brussels, and already now the EU with Great Britain exiting the European Union, France is the major player in the security and defense field. They have the largest military, and they have a lot of military experiences, especially in Africa. And for the French, what matters the most is currently terrorism. And you might have heard they had several smaller attacks, but still it's something that's still very present in France. And so they really care about this fight against terrorism. And then the other big priority for the French is the Sahel and Francophone Africa. But this stands in very stark contrast with Eastern European states, that's Poland, that's the Baltic states, who are very much scared of Russia, and they would like to focus 100% just on some kind of deterrent mechanisms vis-a-vis Russia. And then you have Germany and Italy somewhere in between. But what they really, really are scared of right now is actually another refugee crisis. So they are scared that something similar to what they endured in 2015, 2016, with these massive refugee flows, mostly coming out of Syria, that something like that will happen again. So they, want to use the military to create stability in the southern neighborhood. So this is mostly Syria, Libya, and then, to a certain degree as well, Afghanistan. So you can see here very different perceptions of what the EU, what the military should do. And, this makes creating some kind of independent EU military force very, very hard, because in hindsight, we really see what created a very strong bond and enabled the strength of NATO was that there was a consensus on who the enemy number one was. That was the Soviet Union, at least until the 1990s. But such a unison when it comes to threat perceptions does not exist at the EU level. And that's why, we see what we see. And my own prediction is, probably not much will come of it at least for the foreseeable future.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, and this is a little bit off topic, but I was wondering if what looks like potentially a proxy war happening in Azerbaijan, Armenia, has any implications for what you're thinking about NATO, because of course it involves a key NATO member.
So, probably you saw there was some kind of settlement. So the Russians volunteered to send a peacekeeping force. We have about 2,000 Russian soldiers, patrolling now Nagorno-Karabakh. That, of course, strengthens again the position of Russia, right? It signals it is ready, it is engaged, and it is a force to reckon with. And so, you can just say that this plays to the self-esteem, if you want, of Putin and the Russian military. And that, of course, has then consequences for the EU, for NATO. And to a certain degree, these preferences held in particular in Eastern European states will maybe gain greater relevance because to a certain degree, it shows again, this is what, the Russians really care about. It is to be a military power.
And I suppose, in a way, especially in the wake of Ukraine, it starts forming a type of pattern of peace forces serving perhaps other services. So I'm going to shift a little bit the focus, and I'm sure in Q&A we'll come back to some of these broader issues to do with NATO and the EU. But we have a number of alumni here who are from the UK or living in the UK. Can you talk about the ways in which Brexit factors into the new geometry, the new chess game that is sort of NATO and EU? And although I think, obviously there were hopes for a more, let's say, diplomatic settlement of some issues, it looks like we're heading towards a pretty hard exit in the new year. And I'm curious whether that shifts the power. You're talking about France as a major military power. I'm wondering now, how does EU deal with losing, at least that tight connection with the UK, and whether NATO will serve as some sort of continuing bridge?
So, as you know, Brexit really consumed the UK over the past years. There was basically, until COVID then hit, there was one topic and one topic only, and that was Brexit. And so we could really feel the absence of Great Britain on the international stage on so many topics, and as well in, this entire NATO debate, because the only thing that, folks in London really talked about was how to get this Brexit through. And right now there's, to a certain degree, and I can feel this as well here in Berlin, there's bad blood still. I mean, there hasn't been a settlement. So, the reputation of Great Britain right now in Berlin, at least, is not very positive. And that's a shame because, I know Great Britain quite well. I studied there myself. I know that Great Britain has phenomenal strategic thinkers. It has an incredibly competent military. And it's really a loss for Europe, and it is a loss for NATO in this particular moment that Great Britain doesn't try to be the bridge builder. Right? It doesn't try to bring Europe, continental Europe, and the United States together. And probably even, Biden is a fan of the European Union, by the way, and we predict that he might have a somewhat difficult relationship with Boris Johnson. So probably even for just at least the immediate future, it won't be that bridge builder either. But what is certain, predictions were made that even if the economic relationship and the relationship when it comes to immigration and justice and all these kind of things might loosen, the relationship between continental Europe and the UK in security affairs might actually strengthen after Brexit, because this is where the Brits are really good at and continental Europe is not that good at, right? In a lot of areas, continental Europe doesn't have the same expertise. So my hope is that in the long run, it might actually be one of the pillars that still keeps Europe intact. And of course, as well, that Britain takes on this role as bridge builder between NATO and continental Europe, or the United States and continental Europe and NATO.
I was, well, I think in the next question we'll get to this, but I was thinking it depends a little bit also whether, because I think there were predictions that Brexit would lead to a series of possible exits, and that seems to have faded, at least in my reading, a little bit. We haven't heard as much about Greece and Portugal and other places perhaps choosing to go their own way. So a lot depends on whether the EU in its new configuration is maintainable in its current form. And as I said, I think that's faded. I don't know if you see it differently from your perch, whether...
No, because the Brexit process was so painful. And truth to be told, the expectations, I mean, we will see what happens. Expectations are that Great Britain will, at least in the short to medium term, lose out. And so even countries that are struggling with the euro, maybe it was not a wise choice to join the euro, separate debate though, but such as Greece, Italy, Spain, for now, they're still sticking to EU membership because to a certain degree, Great Britain signaled it's not just, you have a vote and you exit and everything afterwards is easy and beneficial, right? So it was really, it kind of like set an example for how not to do it, at least until now.
So let's look a little bit more into the future. And of course, that's always difficult. No one has a crystal ball. We're not asking you to prognosticate, as we just went through the whole election where people try to look into the future and it's very difficult, opaque glass. But what are the risks and possible future plans to mitigate those risks? And what are the major considerations when we think about NATO, especially in the coming years?
So NATO is undergoing a major shift once again, right? So it underwent a major shift in the 1990s when from focusing exclusively on the Soviet Union, it then took on these expeditionary, state building operations, first in the Balkans, of course, and then in Afghanistan, and then it, got engaged in Libya. And now we see again another shift, at least this is, like where the tendency seems to be going back to Russia. And truth to be told is as well that Europe cannot take on Russia on its own. This is an impossibility. Russia is heavily investing in its military on all sorts of dimensions, cyber, but then as well nuclear, naval capabilities, you name it. It's actually it's very impressive. There's a lot of talk on Chinese military modernization, but when you adjust it for what the financial capabilities are for Russia, it's actually even larger. And Russia knows it only has, or it has a much greater chance for blackmail attempts or, Ukraine, Crimea type activities if NATO is not united. If NATO is united, Russia doesn't really have a chance. But if NATO falls apart, Russia actually can have a chance, for example, in the Baltics. And so it's actually Putin's dream that NATO falls apart, and he actively undermines all sorts of European states so that they that anti-Americanism is growing, and that there are all sorts of like other doubts floating around. And so for me, I believe, as I mentioned before, that Russia's comparative advantage, so to speak, is the military. And, you can't blame them for using this comparative advantage to somehow shape the international arena in their favor. Others, are very good in technology or, like they're good in other, like economic fields. Russia, in the sense, is lagging behind, but they're still at least number two in a lot of military technology. And so why not play it? And NATO needs to be prepared for this new chapter.
So fascinating. There was a question in the chat that I want to sort of insert here. We can come back to it later, but it has something to do with what you just mentioned about how long do you think it will take for the United States to regain its position as a moral leader in the world? Now, that's a very broad question, but I think when you were alluding to the fact that there are active attempts, to undermine American standing in continental Europe and also in the UK, I wonder if you have a sense of, are there paths to Europeans gaining trust? And you referred to this a bit at the beginning, that Biden's election was welcomed, but are there other structural things beyond, let's say, Trump or Biden, that the US can or should be doing to perhaps, I don't know, repair some of the lack of trust that either is coming through disinformation or is just there because of the US actions or lack of action?
I mean, of course, in, the United States, always portrays, and to a certain degree, it's the reality that it can do a lot of things on its own, right? It has formidable military capabilities. It is still the foremost economic power. And so I think, Europeans sometimes, like don't really understand that there is, that actually US interest in Europe is real. And I think here's why it is actually real. And, like the real challenge for the United States is China, right? So this is the rising power in the Pacific. But if the United States really wants to take on the China challenge in the Pacific, it will be in a much better position if the West is united and if Europe is actually on board with the United States than if the West is divided and if Europe keeps on doing a lot of trade with China as it does today. But this is not necessarily a message that the United States communicates, right? So like the message that at least Europeans receive is, well, like we are actually pretty good on our own. We can help you, but it's not that we actually need you. And sometimes I think, just expressing that this is a mutual dependency for mutual gain, I think could be really beneficial.
So we have another question which is related to this. So I think I'm going to insert it here. Jason Ulmer is asking, hi Jason, by the way. The US has long been a leader in NATO. What role should the US play when it comes to EU security and defense? Last week's decision on PESCO, third state participation, seems to be a real opening for the US to engage further. But will these efforts undermine NATO, especially with France pushing the EU to do more and be more aggressive on the world stage?
So I think, the United States has a very rocky relationship with EU defense. So for, the longest time in the 1990s, there was basically, a denial or a rejection. The EU should not develop any kind of independent security and defense policy. And then, it changed a little bit, but still, I would say in the big picture of things, the United States looks at it either, with a sense of nothing's ever going to happen, or, this is threatening the cohesion of NATO. And I think there needs to be a more proactive and maybe a more benign view. I think it could help NATO if Europeans were, for example, spending more on defense, if they would reach this famous 2% mark. But, they need to do it so that capabilities are created that then actually can interact with American capability, and that, in the big picture of things, it makes sense in a strategic framework. Because right now, the European capability initiatives and like what PESCO is supposed to do and, everything that's happening very much happens strategically, not in collaboration with the United States. And so, yes, there is a real risk of duplication and, just like starting to get into patterns and interoperability that is not entirely compatible with the United States. And I think it's stupid. And it's maybe even dangerous. But here again, it needs to be a little bit US outreach needs to happen as well, and say, we want you to develop your capabilities, but, let's do this together. And maybe you can take on, a certain niche capabilities. You can get really good in these particular capabilities, but you don't actually need to, duplicate capabilities that we already have.
So one follow-up on NATO, and then maybe we can broaden the discussion a little bit. What considerations do you think, or are there ways to reframe or reconceive of NATO that would serve it well in the coming decades? I mean, are there progressive movements sort of rethink its mission, not just as anti-Russia or as a defense pact? I don't know, I'm just sort of curious if there's any discussions about some fundamental rethinking of its function.
So, Biden is he personally, I think he's very interested in the transatlantic relationship. He has voiced this many, many times. And he has this, it seems at least what comes out. So I'm working here a little bit with the German government, and like the first voices that they have heard from the Biden administration to be, is that they would like to first, build on other issues and then tackle NATO. So, for example, they would like to work on the environment, and of course, this is something this is. For Germany, that's absolutely perfect, and they would like to reinvigorate the transatlantic relationship by these non-security issues, recreate trust, maybe as well engage the young generation, because this is something that I find very frightening. Young Germans, so like the 18, 25-year-olds, have very negative views of the United States. They actually prefer China to the United States, which I find incomprehensible. So I think a lot of work needs to be done here, and maybe it's easier to get at those folks, via climate change and other cooperation initiatives. And then once some kind of trust is rebuilt and some kind of, closer bonds are reestablished, then I think we do need to tackle the security issue. I think, NATO at the heart is a security alliance. This is what brought the transatlantic community in the end together. And, this was the bond during the Cold War. And without it, I don't think it would be the same. And truth to be told, I think Europe could not, at least not at present stage, survive. It cannot right now fulfill its security on its own.
So there's a question in the chat I wanted to raise, which is a little, I think, different from what we've had. I don't know if you're prepared to answer this one, but maybe you have some comments. Jerry Ezrick's asking, what do you expect Boris Johnson to do regarding EU negotiations insofar as the Northern Ireland border is concerned, given Biden's likely support of an open border?
Yeah, I think Boris Johnson is in a very bad position, period. I think he was banking a lot on American support as well for a trade agreement to compensate for probably some likely losses when it comes to EU trade, especially in services. And it really looks like, that Biden will be on board with the EU and not with Boris Johnson, and that might affect then as well, Northern Ireland and Ireland and the entire story there. And I think it will be very hard, very, very hard if you have very strong criticism coming out of the United States, coming out of, the EU, criticizing any type of actions that Boris Johnson, so if he wants to backpedal the deal that was made, so to have a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And I doubt it that he will get away with it that easily, although probably, he will have certain support in Great Britain, but the international voices probably will be overwhelming.
Well, and I think, to light a match under that tinderbox would be quite, it would be very sad after all of the years of the Troubles. I wanted to turn for a moment to peacekeeping, because at least as I was reflecting on your work, your book that I read last year and loved, this notion, in a way, I think there was a hope that peacekeeping would draw Europe and the US together, right? Because multilateralism around these seemingly clear moral imperatives in the world would appear to be an opportunity to forge multinational sort of coalitions. And yet, as we look back at the various ones, whether it's the Balkans, whether it's in the Middle East, Libya, etc., they seem to cause as many fractions and factions as sort of collaboration. I'm curious where you think peacekeeping is now, and whether, what the future of peacekeeping is, and I suppose this draws us a little bit to the UN, which I'm not sure is squarely in your bailiwick, but, what is the role of the UN relative to NATO and the EU as well? And maybe that's a broader question, but peacekeeping was the thrust of what I was trying to get at.
Mm-hmm. So I think the enthusiasm for peacekeeping that existed in the 1990s and to a certain degree as well in the 2000s is gone. And why is it gone? Because we have so many instances of these multilateral interventions just, not succeeding. Of course, the most famous one was Iraq, but then, and the entire aftermath, but then truth to be told, Afghanistan is as well. I would call it, a disaster, and it's, whatever happens there with the Taliban peace deal. I don't think it will end as it was promised to end, when we first intervened. And then, of course, you have Libya. That's as well a total disaster. That's the latest NATO operation, civil war, at the brink of actually collapsing already. And then, you have some instances, so the Balkans is a little bit of a better example, so Bosnia-Herzegovina is fairly stable. Kosovo, I wouldn't call it an exemplary state, but better than most other cases. But in the big picture of things, I think the promises that the international community, now I speak of the UN, of NATO, of these ad hoc operations in general, the promises that they had with regards to peacekeeping were just not fulfilled. And so I think really, there are these waves in international security. So sometimes it's about great powers, and then, it's about human rights, and then it's about, democracy promotion and these kind of things. And I think the wave that we saw, which was first peacekeeping wave in the 1990s, and then, of course, after 9/11, the fight against terrorism, but still always related to this notion of creating stability, creating democracies, because there was this ideology of if you just have democracies, terrorism wouldn't thrive. I think this is really over. And, as you know, and probably a lot of our members in the audience, it is indeed another age of great power politics, where we will focus on these interstate conflicts. And this is the conflict in the Pacific. And then, to a certain degree, it is a conflict that in one way or another involves Russia.
So I think you may have just answered the question I had in mind, which was about, we have a new administration coming in the United States. You are one of the professors, one of the academics in our world who has been involved with foreign policy, and a lot of politicians, a lot of people in the defense world. If you were asked, what should be the top 3 things the new Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense, I'm not sure which you would prefer to be advising, but what would you say are some of the big issues? And I think, as I said, you just referred to a couple, but maybe you just want to sort of bore into that a little bit and see if there's anything else there.
Mm-hmm. I think the most important thing, and this is probably it concerns the entire administration, so not just the Secretary of State or Defense. But, you need to understand, I was myself, born in Germany, and then I, emigrated to the United States as a teenager. And America symbolized, and I'm really speaking here, from the heart of an immigrant, symbolized an open country, right? It still symbolized, that this was a country where dreams could become true if you just work hard. But, the bottom line was it was open. If you're willing to go there and give your all, invest your all, you could make a life there. And unfortunately, the Trump administration stole that dream by closing the borders and by being hostile to foreigners. And I think this is very, very detrimental, because, I think for all of us, it's at least pretty clear that the wealth and the power of the United States comes from the diversity of people who immigrated to the United States and then, built a lot of fantastic stuff, businesses, but then as well, had ideas, fantastic, universities, amazing scientific achievements. And I think you need to rebuild this image, because I think the greatest power of the United States is attract talent, global talent, and then, offer them a platform where they can thrive. And unfortunately, and I can feel this here in Europe, where, among my parents and even, when I was growing up, there was the dream of going to the United States and make it there. And unfortunately, right now, this dream is gone. And I feel this is something that hopefully can be reestablished, rebuilt.
Yeah, it's an interesting comment. I think it's very different in different European countries. There was a different post-war experience in different places. I think if my friends in France didn't have the same opinion as my friends in Germany, let's say, of roughly our generation or your generation. So I'm going to open the floor to questions and answers. I'll keep on asking questions, but I want to make sure if you have questions, now is a good time to put them in the Q&A, and I'll try to get to them. So this is a question that it's always, deans always hate asking of their colleagues because you often see fear in their eyes. But since you've been on sabbatical, what are you working on? You know, what's your next project? What's on the horizon for Marina Henke in terms of research?
So I'm working on Russia, and that's why I'm based as well in Berlin, because it's a very interesting place. And it is what type of doctrine, what kind of strategy can NATO write when it comes to Russia, right? So Russia has a lot of its most brilliant strategic thinkers employed writing strategy. How can they somehow exercise power and undermine, NATO, the West? We know some of these ideas and some of these doctrines, but NATO is very slow in writing strategy on its own. And I'm involved in these processes on various levels, working with governments, but then as well, like trying to find out how vulnerable is actually European public opinion to these blackmail attempts, because I think this is really the Achilles heel right now, that there's certain, some call it complacency, other call it pacifism. They basically say Russia is fine, the Cold War ended, and we actually are always trying to sue for peace. And this is a little bit the danger, that when Russia undertakes certain actions, that Western European public is going to get so scared, and that they're going to go on the street and demonstrate. And that will put so much pressure on the German government, but as well, you can imagine the Dutch government, Scandinavian governments, and so forth, and that basically their hands are tied, and that that then paralyzes NATO. And of course, that can be very dangerous, especially if the Russians are counting on that kind of reaction.
So I'm going to shift a little bit again, maybe to an area which is not precisely in your research, but since you're in Germany and seeing it with those eyes, obviously Angela Merkel has been sort of a linchpin for a lot of, let's say, foreign policy that's not, let's say, on the neoliberal side of things, spreading democracy, but also not on the isolationist sort of side. I mean, but without her, she'll be stepping down relatively soon. There already are successes, I think, sort of in the pipeline. Do you see any shift for the role of Germany, with the absence of Merkel? Because she really, did, especially after the election of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson, I think represent a type of centrist foreign policy to the world. And I'm just wondering, what do you see, especially with the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland and other things like this? What sort of pressures are going to be on a new chancellor in Germany?
Mm. Absolutely. I mean, she will be missed. But at the same time, I think for Germany proper, it's actually quite important to have a change as well, because as always, if you're for too long in power, certain structures just become very rigid, and that's no good either. So right now, what Germany expects is some kind of coalition government, bringing in the Green Party. And so the Green Party is very pacifist. So, for example, when it comes to Russia to a certain degree as well, when it comes to NATO, they would say, we don't need it. So they would and I'm generalizing a little bit, but an ideal German security posture under Green Party would be something that the Swiss have. So you're getting along with everyone, and you're you're waving the white flag and say, we have started wars in the past. Now we're sitting future wars out, and we're just like trading with everyone and try to be a neutral country. And it's it's an interesting debate to have, whether that's feasible. Germany, of course, is a country at the heart of Europe. It's 80 million people. Switzerland, much smaller. I think it's 7 million. So it would be a gamble, yeah. But you can see already that this will, of course, create certain tensions. And yeah, it's hard to say where it will lead to.
I was thinking of, you mentioned before about investment potentially in a nuclear defense for Europe, which seems a really tough sell for a German government with the Greens involved. That seems to be unlikely. And then I know very little about the attempts to have the nuclear deproliferation treaties re-signed with Russia. I don't know if you know anything about where that sort of would go under the new administration. Is it the START treaty? I think that's the one, right?
Yeah, so, New START is basically just between the United States and Russia. And I think Biden will actually probably, it looks like they will try to renew it, although, let's see what the Senate says. But absolutely, you're absolutely right that, the Green Party will probably not support a Euro deterrent force. That's for sure.
Yeah, which, that's why I was connecting the two, because if it's impossible to have a nuclear, let's say, collaboration among Europeans, it's just, it would seem really an imperative to get the START or the New START signed, so there is this sort of global consensus about nuclear arms, but that seems to have broken down in our lifetimes as well, which is, strange turnaround. So I'm looking for questions out there. Now is the time. If you want to ask your questions, I can keep on trying to plumb my interest, but I'd be curious to know if any of you out there have any further questions for Professor Henke. We're very close to the end. Well, I don't see any in the chat, so I'm going to close by thanking Marina. It's great to see you. I look forward to chatting when you get back to Evanston, if we're ever allowed to travel again. We'll find out. We didn't even talk. This is actually the first time. I think you mentioned COVID once, but I don't think I mentioned it. And that is also another issue that actually intersects with all the issues we've discussed today. But I wish you the best on the rest of your sabbatical. And I just want to say thank you so much to all of you. I hope you've, out there in Cyberland, I hope you've had a good time listening to us and enjoyed these 45 minutes. I hope you have a wonderful day or evening, depending on where you are. And I'm sorry to all of our European friends, many of you whom I've got to know over the years, that I haven't been over there for a while, but I hope to return to Europe as soon as I can once the travel restrictions are loosened up. So my sincere thanks to all of you for your continuing support of the university and what we're doing, and supporting research along the lines, this type of, I think I can call it translational social science that Marina Henke is engaging with. We think about the translation of scientific research quite often into drugs or into techniques for surgery, etc. We also have a lot of political scientists and social scientists who are producing work that is engaged with the world in concrete ways. And Professor Henke's is an example of that type of work. So thanks for joining us. We'll see some of you next time, and have a good day.
Thanks.